Lego is one of those things that's been with me for my entire life, but there was a period in the mid-2000s where one of their brands captivated me like no other: Bionicle. To say that I was obsessed would be an understatement. I had every single figure from the first few lineups, and I took these guys everywhere. This series was omnipresent, and I was the exact right age for when this craze took over the playground. Yet, for as much fun as I had going online reading summaries, I mostly focused on the figures and, like, one video game. It wasn't until years later, when I watched a huge video that my friend Billiam made, that I was exposed to the modern Bionicle fandom. I had no idea just how expansive the lore was, and how dedicated the modern fanbase continues to be. But I was also more surprised to find out that Bionicle actually had their own comic books that were made by freaking DC. I wanted to know more, but every time that I watched a video or read a series recap, I noticed that the comics went severely overlooked. If anything, they would get like a passing mention, and that was that. So why are these comics so ignored? Well, talking about comic books is literally my job, so I wanted to get to the bottom of this. But what I found was just weird.
Did somebody say the late 90s and/or early 2000s?
Well, would you look at that? It's cult classic YouTube sensation Billiam, who I cleverly alluded to earlier on in the script.
I didn't go too far into detail about the Bionicle comics in my video, so I figured this would be a great opportunity for Drake to do all the work, and for me to learn a little something along the way.
That's great. Regardless, the Bionicle comics aren't really weird because of the normal comic booky stuff, but rather they represent to me just how convoluted this brand was in the first place. However, in order to truly understand why the comics are the black sheep of the Bionicle family, we're gonna need to go all the way back.
Although an iconic product for decades, the 90s proved to be a challenging time for Lego. Most of their sets were just that, sets. Kids would build various pieces and make their own stories, but the company saw potential in selling kits with storylines of their own. They started off by licensing Star Wars, a line that continues to be one of their best sellers. However, despite performing well, Lego has to pay Lucasfilm's royalties, which certainly cuts into their profits.
In order to truly change their profitability, Lego needed an original story-driven IP of their own. Enter the Slicer Throwbots. These did alright, but weren't really a smash success. So enter Lego's second attempt, the Robo Riders. These also saw moderate success, but again, it wasn't enough. You see, although both of these lines did have bits of story, they didn't captivate audiences in the way that they had hoped. The kids that liked them tended to just gravitate towards the robotic designs of the toys.
The next attempt needed to be bigger and bolder, so by reworking a concept being kicked around called the Boneheads of Voodoo Island, Bionicle was officially born. The plotline of the series was only meant to last for about a year or so, but these toys ended up becoming a worldwide phenomenon, and the push was extended even further. Bionicle became Lego's most popular property and almost single-handedly put Lego into a new golden age.
Although the toys themselves were the largest component to its success, the lore of the series was profitable in its own right. The official website contained several bits and pieces of plot in the form of text, animations, and a couple of flash games called Montanui, the online game. In its heyday, the official Bionicle site received over 1 million hits each month. Even standalone lore-heavy products were able to turn a profit, including video games, a series of books that were purchasable at the pinnacle of elementary school hype, the Scholastic Book Fair, and of course, the comics. In order to finally talk about the Bionicle's comics, I actually had to track down copies to read, but that proved to be somewhat difficult. Finding physical issues of the Bionicle comics was tough, since comic book tie-ins to other properties are 1, usually not preserved, and 2, generally overlooked by secondhand retail shops. To make things even more difficult, they were released in a way that's unique from almost every other comic ever made. You see, the Bionicle comics were distributed along with Lego Club magazine, and I don't know about you guys, but outside of my old Nintendo powers, the old magazines at my house growing up got recycled. There's really not much use for a 3-year-old copy of GQ. Plus, I'm sure that not every single person who received Lego Club magazine even cared about Bionicle, so these non-fans probably threw the comic away as well. That is the only way that I can justify the utter lack of copies that I've been able to find in the wild, since I've also seen claims online that when it was in publication, Bionicle was the most distributed comic in the world. Oddly enough, the cover of each issue of the Bionicle comic has a price tag, which means that some of these books could have actually been sold in legit comic shops, but I haven't seen any reference to their distribution besides that of Lego Club magazine. Regardless, the Bionicle community has done an excellent job of archiving like pretty much everything to have ever been released with the Bionicle logo on it, and I was able to find scans of every single comic on a fan site called the Biomedia Project. Quick aside here, for some reason my PDF viewer updated most of the text so that it's crystal clear like domestic beer, while the art is still super low res. Not that it matters much since I still have to remove the text anyway due to copyright.
These first comics, along with the rest of the multimedia properties, follow the Toa Mata, 6 warriors with elemental powers and special masks which give them additional abilities. They're trying to stop the evil Makuta, who it later turns out was just one of many other bad guys that are also known as Makuta. Neat. Before they can take on the big bad, the Toa need to search the island of Matanui, who is also a person? Bionicle? Toy? For additional masks so that they can have even more firepower. Each additional mask is the same as the other ones worn by members of the Toa, but just in their special color. Please buy them all.
It's a relatively straightforward concept to start with. Find the MacGuffins, fight the bad guy. What really got me excited to keep reading the comics though was the absolutely killer art. I especially love how the characters are drawn to look just like their Lego counterparts, but man, that must have been a hassle to keep redrawing over and over for panels. But seriously, massive props to artist Carlos D'Anda for making these look so good for the first 9 issues. Additionally, the beginning of the comic does a great job of easing new readers in by focusing on the Toa of Ice, Kopaka, as its main character. The fact that the storytelling grounded itself by focusing on just one character at first for the world to open up to is smart. The writing is also pretty decent, with the exposition dumps being just about as natural as you'd expect a tie-in comic trying to sell toys to be. And man, did this series try to sell toys. The pages in between the actual comic were stuffed to the brim with so many ads, extra story bits, lists of things for kids to beg their parents to buy, sweepstakeses, and so much more. For context, let's look at issue 2 of the comic. It's 23 pages long, and only 12 pages were of the actual story, 13 if you include the opening recap. That means that nearly half of the pages in this comic were reserved for ads. I mean, besides the fact that the story itself was an ad as well. Please buy them all. This is also where my problems with the comic starts to arise. It's clear that these books were the least important to the overarching franchise. They jump around a lot, and anybody who's reading them and not consuming the series in other ways, like me, is missing material. Like, as I was reading, the Toa just suddenly have their golden masks, which grant them the power of every single mask all at once, and they had already defeated the big bad Makuta off panel. In the previous issue, they were simply fighting creatures with no indication that they were nearing the end of their first quest. After consulting with some of my friends who know way more about Bionicle than I ever will, it turns out that no one product had all or even most of the storyline. Everything sort of skips around. So in order to really understand what was going on in this epic storyline, you would need to read the books, the comics, go online to the website, play the games, and everything in order.
Well here, Drake, I found this reading order online.
How did you... Oh no.
One eternity later.
So after doing some more digging, I found that the core of the original Bionicle plotline comes from the book Tale of the Toa and from Matanui, the online game. There's a website called Wall of History which does a significantly better job of making things coherent while also providing some nicer quality scans of the Bionicle comics. It appears these comics really did mostly serve as vehicles to deliver advertisements, with the plot details that they added being so insignificant that in some of the reading lists that I found online of which media to consume, they're completely listed separately. This is especially weird since throughout the entirety of the first comic run, they were all written by the same writer, Greg Farshtein.
Varsity is a legend in the fandom. He was the head of Bionicle lore, wrote all of these comics, the vast majority of the actual books, and the movie, Bionicle, The Legend Reborn. It's crazy that despite being directly created by the man behind it all, the comics really only existed to add value to LEGO Club magazine subscriptions and satiate the hungry fan base with the smallest bits of informational tidbits. However, there's something oddly beautiful about the Bionicle comics. Although this franchise existed throughout all forms of media, the comics were the most consistently produced out of them all. Since the beginning, there were always Bionicle comics. Even when the books were over, when the web serials were left unfinished, when the entire Bionicle lines of toys and media were ended due to declining sales and waning popularity, the comics were there until the very end. Even the final issue of the comic series ended, showing the epic showdown between the two, more or less, gods of the series universe. Despite the fandom overlooking them in favor of the text-heavy lore and the various animations, the comics were there throughout every arc of this prolific series, and unites them as the interlocking Lego pieces and connective tissue to the series.
If the claim I mentioned earlier is true, then the Bionicle comics were once the most widely distributed comic in the entire world, with nearly 2 million units a month going out to consumers via LEGO Club magazine. This is a number unlike anything that the comic industry was seeing at the time, and even to this day. When I mentioned that I was doing this video on my YouTube community page, dozens of people left comments talking about how excited they were and how much these were a part of their childhood. In a time where the mainstream comic industry was really starting to hurt, and with even Marvel Comics being on the edge of bankruptcy, including these comics with the magazine introduced a lot of kids to the medium of comics. Though I do think that there was a major missed opportunity to tell a self-contained story within these books. As someone who wasn't immersed in the lore, I thought that the comics would have more for me to chew on. Other licensed series like Transformers and Ghostbusters exist in plenty of other mediums, but the self-contained style of their comics have allowed them to not only build cult followings, but they've also continued on in a way where the movies, TV shows, and even toy lines haven't.
Multimedia storytelling is a delicate balancing act in order for fans to enjoy the core of the thing they're engaging with. Some video games like Overwatch and Destiny are going down the same route, and it's been frustrating to a lot of players. Ideally, fans don't need to consume everything to enjoy a franchise, and the standalone quality of the work should give them enough experience so that it encourages them to try out the other media. Instead of jumping all over the place and rigidly keeping every piece of Bionicle a part of the lore, I think LEGO should have created a unique, isolated experience within the comics, which would have encouraged readers to go explore the other parts of the lore. But what do I know? Bionicle and LEGO clearly made buckets and buckets of money.
Personally, this video got me interested in the Bionicle toys all over again, and since I didn't have any of my original figures from when I was growing up, I've actually been hitting up my local LEGO store and building new ones from scratch. And although I haven't been won over by the lore, I actually do have a newfound respect for the Bionicle community. Bionicle is definitely one of the most convoluted things that I have ever taken a look at on this channel, but it's also remarkably well preserved. And although it was a pain in the ass to research, I thoroughly enjoyed myself the entire time, and I definitely felt like a kid again. Anyway, thanks for coming by, Billiam. You've been a great help.
No problem, man. Thanks for having me. And now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go back to organizing my mighty beans.
But hey, if you like this video, then why not consider subscribing, or even watching like the rest of the series. It's called Because Comics, and I take a look at all the crazy, strange, and straight up bizarre things that make comic books, well, comic books. Maybe you'll find them interesting. I don't know. But I also do want to say thanks again to Billiam for coming onto the channel. It was a lot of fun to work with him, and his Bionicles video is actually what inspired this entire thing. So if you haven't already, please go to his channel, watch his video. They're both really cool. But anyway, I hope you learned at least a little something new, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.